welcome to today's NOAHE rounds, where I'm talking about probabilistic one-way sensitivity analysis. Just to acknowledge that what the material I'm presenting today is the product of a lot of people's hard work and thoughts. We got funding from Genome Canada, CIHR, a little bit of funding through CADITH, the U of A, and the Capital Health Research Endowment at the U of A, as well as some funds out of Institute of Health Economics. My co-authors on this work are Mike Polden, Isaac Oneway, Andrew Sutton, Peter Hall at the University of Edinburgh, and Giovanni Tremonti, also at the University of Edinburgh. Obviously, any errors or omissions are my responsibility. So, what are we going to talk about today? I'm going to provide a bit of background, making sure everyone's on the same page, so to speak, about sensitivity analysis and why we need it. Give a quick overview of the problems with one-way sensitivity analysis as it's done conventionally. Identify some of the barriers to doing it better. And then talk about, I'll describe some recently published work that we've done to describe a new approach to one-way sensitivity analysis that overcomes the problems with conventional approaches, and will, if people have specific questions as we go along, they can drop them in the chat, and I'll try and keep an eye on that. And hopefully should have about 15 minutes available at the end of this hour for questions. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started. So, there are numerous sources of uncertainty in economic evaluations, which what we're going to talk about today only really addresses one of them, truth be told. So there's the sampling variation that we're all concerned with and familiar with in pretty much any area of research. There's uncertainty about how we extrapolate from available evidence. There's methodological uncertainty. Are the methods we applied the most appropriate? Have we constructed the right type of model? How are we discounting costs and benefits? How are we valuing benefits? All these are methodological uncertainties. There's generalizability and transferability. So, can we generalize from the evidence that we're using as inputs to the model, to the population that are going to be subject to the decision that we're trying to inform, and can we take the results of analysis that's done in one setting or for one population and apply them to a decision that's going to affect a different setting or a different population? And then there's model structure. Have we structured the decision problem? And is that reflected in the model correctly? There's the famous George Box comment that all models are wrong, but some models are useful, and that speaks to our uncertainty in the model structure. There are well understood approaches for dealing with uncertainty, sampling variation, where we look at confidence intervals and credible ranges for the ICEs. There's extrapolation. Statistical modeling is how we usually attempt to extrapolate from the available data, but we can look at scenario analyses, we can look at model weighting. Generalizability and transferability we frequently address through scenario analysis. And sensitivity analysis is kind of the umbrella term for a lot of these analytical approaches to quantifying and determining the importance from a decision-making perspective of the uncertainties that we have. So what is sensitivity analysis? Generally, it's the process of varying the values of inputs and recording the impact of those changes on model outputs. And conventionally, we talk about one-way sensitivity analysis, multi-way sensitivity analysis, which is very similar to scenario analyses. We have threshold analyses where you try and identify the value of a parameter at which there is a change in the decision indicated by the cost effectiveness ratio the result. So trying to find the point at which maybe the price, at what point will the change in the price lead to you saying something that in the central reference case analysis is deemed not cost effective becomes cost effective, and vice versa. Probabilistic sensitivity analysis is where we use probability distributions to describe parameter values. So we don't use a single value for each parameter. We use a probability distribution which expresses our beliefs on the possible range of values that parameter could take and how likely each of those values are to be observed as the expected value. And we then use Monte Carlo simulation to generate distributions of the expected costs and outcomes, and by that, and by extension, a distribution or an expression of the uncertainty around the incremental cost effectiveness ratio. Focus for today, as I say, is one-way sensitivity analysis, that first one, where we're varying the value of a single parameter. And here's Drummond et al. From the most recent edition, I think it's the 4th edition, how they describe the one-way sensitivity analysis. Single values for each of the input parameters are used to estimate the expected cost, effect, and net benefit based upon their mean values. The parameter values are varied, and the effect on model outputs are reported. So it's when it's to address a decision maker's question, which I'm sure we've all encountered, which is if the effectiveness took this value, or if the price was this, or if the mortality rate was this, what would be the result? And it's a very sensible question for decision makers to ask. They know that we are uncertain, that we're trying to predict a future. We're not saying this is what happens now, we're trying to predict what will happen in the future. So it's very sensible for them to say, what if this parameter took this value? What would be the effect? And one-way sensitivity analysis is a response to that question. And that question, or that type of question, is never going to go away. And so we need to be able to do one-way sensitivity analyses to meet the needs of the decision makers, because we as the analysts are there for the decision makers. If we're not being useful to them, then we need to do something else. The primary criticisms of this approach are, well, there's 4 primary criticisms of conventional one-way sensitivity analysis. First of all, the range of values used are often arbitrary. Analysts may say, well, we looked at the mean plus or minus 25%. Or plus or minus 50%. Well, why not plus or minus 26%, or 13%, or 87%? There isn't a reason, there isn't a rationale, it's arbitrary. It's that kind of the analyst's judgment about what will be a reasonable range to demonstrate the sensitivity of the outputs to a change in the inputs. But it's not really the sensitivity of the outputs that we're interested in. It's the sensitivity of the decision to changes in values, or the indicated decision to changes in value of that parameter that we're interested in. And just picking a percentage variation, or even an absolute value variation, is arbitrary. We need to choose a range that reflects the evidence we have about the uncertainty around the true value of a parameter, or the value we expect to see in practice for the parameter. And conventional approaches don't do that. And somebody's asked, what's the criticism regarding picking X number of standard errors above and below the mean? Well, on the upside, David Ben Israel, sorry, David, a good question. On the upside, at least the standard error is based upon the evidence, in the evidence we have about the uncertainty. But again, if you choose one standard error, plus or minus one standard error, why not two? Why not 2.5? Yeah, well, that's you're choosing to curtail the range that you look at, and what we're arguing really is you need to use the full range described by the probability density function, because that's the, that's not arbitrary. It's based in the evidence. It's not arbitrary, because what you then get is information, more information, not just about the sensitivity, but whether it changes the decision and how likely it is to be observed. And that's the third point. So second point, deterministic approaches ignore correlations and non-linearities in the model. And therefore, if there is a non-linear model, and most models are non-linear, certainly Markov models, you're going to get biased estimates of the expected value. And similarly, if there are correlations between parameters in the model, which frequently there are, you're going to get biased estimates of the expected values, costs and outcomes. And so you're actually going to get misleading results. Third one, I think this is really important, is these deterministic approaches do not tell decision makers how likely it is that a specific value will actually occur. So just because there exists a possible value that would change the decision from fund to don't fund or vice versa, if there is a 60% chance of that value being observed, or values in that range more likely being observed, that is very different from if there's a 1% chance of values in that range being observed. How a decision maker would process that and use that information, I think, is very different under those two scenarios. And so just showing decision makers that there is a value, a possible value that exists that would change the decision, is unhelpful. And actually, over many years of observing decision makers use what we produce, we know that I have observed that when they are facing a emotionally or politically, with a small p, difficult decision, if we tell them there is a value which allows you to say yes to this, and we don't tell them how likely that value is, then the temptation for them to say, well, we'll say yes because it could be this, and we haven't said whether it's more or less likely than the expected value. If we tell them that there's only a 1% chance of a value that would lead to a positive decision being indicated by the results of the analysis, that's much more helpful. It helps them to actually stick to their guns and to bite the bullet of difficult decisions, and to be explicit if they are making a decision to recommend a technology that is nominally not cost effective for other reasons about social values, whether it's equity, whether it's a belief that the value of the severity component of the disease is adequately captured in the quality, whatever it is, by being clear about what the sensitivity analysis for the parameter says and being more complete, we enable the decision makers to be more explicit, transparent, and thereby consistent in their decision making when they're actually relying on other social value propositions to support a decision to make a positive reimbursement. So the fourth problem that's frequently made about conventional one-way sensitivity analysis is that tornado diagrams, which is the conventional way of presenting them, can often mislead decision makers. So here's a tornado diagram, and I've got three questions there. If you look at this, you look at the utility, it looks about 50-50. So is there a 50% chance that the utility parameter takes a value that produces a positive net benefit? Similarly, is there around a 20% chance that the effectiveness parameter takes a value that produces a negative net benefit? Or a 90% chance that the cost parameter takes a value that produces a positive net benefit? These are intuitively natural interpretations of a tornado diagram. But actually, it doesn't give you any of that information. All it says is that over the arbitrary range of values chosen for these three parameters, there are values that could produce both positive and negative net benefits. When you recognize that that's all the tornado diagram says, it's almost like a very long way of saying, well, we don't really know. And how helpful is that to a decision maker? But if I did, not trained in the methods of analyses, which most of the people who sit on these decision-making committees are not, if I look at that, I think it would be perfectly reasonable to interpret the utility parameter as saying, well, the sensitivity of the decision to the utility value, well, about 50% of the time, it's going to take a value that leads to a positive net benefit. And there's an 80% chance that the effectiveness will drive a positive net benefit. And I would naturally interpret it that way, but that information is not in a tornado diagram. So tornado diagrams can mislead, and that's highly problematic, I think. So barriers to doing better, and I have to put my hand up here. So the background to this slide is a paper that I was a co-author on with Carl Claxton and Mark Sculfer a few years ago about probabilistic sensitivity analysis and explaining why early in 2000s at NICE we made it not an optional extra but mandatory as part of the reference case. And this is a quote, I'm sure you've all read it by now. It was recognized that in making an assessment of the implications of decisional uncertainty when issuing guidance, the appraisal committee will also need an understanding of the contribution of specific parameters. This contribution to decision uncertainty can be assessed using value of information methods for individuals and groups of parameters. Of course, this is wrong. It tells you what the value of knowing more is, or knowing with certainty the value of a parameter. So that it tells you the change in the risk of making the wrong decision, value of information analyses methods. It doesn't address the same question or problem that one-way sensitivity analysis addresses, which what is the probability that this parameter will take a value which changes the indicated decision? It's closely related. The analyses, as you'll see, are almost identical, but they are different decisions. They're the analyses to address different questions. And therefore, I think when we wrote this, that value of information analysis actually addressed the decision problem or the question that decision makers have when they are seeking one-way sensitivity analysis. We were wrong. But I think that kind of meant that people didn't worry about this issue. They thought, oh, it was sorted. And we were wrong. And so we stalled progress. And as you'll see, actually, the methods to do the analysis were already known at this point in time. And I think we stalled progress in good practice with just this not fully considered paragraph in this otherwise strong paper. A second thing that we noted in that same paper was about the computational burden of probabilistic sensitivity analysis. And we got a huge amount of pushback at the time of this guidance. So the actual guidance was produced in 2003-4, and we got a huge amount of pushback saying that the computational burden of running these types of analyses was too much, and it was unreasonable to expect people to do these sorts of analyses. So in here, this is, again, a quote out of the paper, and it says, in order to characterize decision uncertainty, a second level of simulation is required, and this would, for some models, require considerable computation time. And that was undoubtedly true. What I would say since then is actually that's no longer the case. So these are... this is results from a paper published in 2017 by my research group, where we just compared the efficiency of different software for cost-effectiveness modeling. And you can see, so here with this table is the time required for 10,000 simulations. So the mean time in MATLAB is 11.22 seconds. In R, it's 31. Excel is in minutes, but it's still it's under 15 minutes. Triage, sadly, is in hours, and therefore, for serious modeling and probabilistic work, is probably not great. And I wouldn't recommend it, but certainly we are now in a position where the computational burden barrier to doing probabilistic one-way sensitivity analysis is that's not an issue anymore. So I think we're in a better position, and we should take advantage of the better resources we have available to us these days. So what should one-way sensitivity analysis do? So in our paper, we argue that to identify whether a parameter can take a value that changes the decision, so to move the result from a positive net benefit to a negative net benefit, or vice versa. So it's about decision uncertainty. It's not sensitivity of the result, it's sensitivity of the decision that we're really trying to address with one-way sensitivity analysis. It should be done in a way that takes account of correlations between parameters in the model. And so probabilistic approaches with the capturing of joint distributions is important where those correlations exist, and the sensitivity analysis should run in a way that respects those and captures those. To reiterate and repeat myself, as I do a lot, it should provide data on the probability that such values will be observed. It's not just that they're possible or plausible. We need to be able to say, decision makers, there is a 10% chance or a 20% chance that this parameter will take a value which would change the positive net benefit of the reference case analysis to a negative net benefit, for example. And finally, it should present this information in an easy to understand format. So again, repeat myself again, our decision makers, the people who sit on the committees that make these decisions, tend not to be trained analysts, clinicians, doctors, pharmacists, trialists, some health economists, some statisticians, but generally a majority of the people sitting on these panels are not trained analysts like ourselves, and thinking about these things is not their day job. Therefore, it's our responsibility to make sure that the insights we provide are easily accessible to them. So, probabilistic one-way sensitivity analysis, POSA, as we call it, is implemented by running a modified version of the standard two-level simulation approach that's required for, and there's an error here, it should be the expected value of perfect parameter information, not just the expected value of perfect information. You can get that from the single-level simulation outputs. So it's a modified version of the standard two-level simulation required for expected value of perfect parameter information. Just define a couple of terms first. When I talk about the outer loop, what I mean is the range of values in the distribution of the parameter of interest. And often I will talk about them as either the centiles or the deciles of the distribution. The inner loop is the full probabilistic sensitivity analysis or Monte Carlo simulation that's applied to all the other parameters in the model whilst holding the value of the chosen parameter, the one we're interested in, fixed at the value sampled or selected for the outer loop. Okay. So it is remarkably simple to do this, to be honest. And that's why I've set it out in steps. So step one, obviously, is to select the parameter to subject to POSA. And then you sample the outer loop value for that parameter. Step three is to run the inner loop simulation. And then you record what we call the conditional expected costs and outcomes for each strategy in the evaluation. So it's conditional because it's conditional upon the parameter taking the selected value. Okay. So once you've recorded the outputs of that first simulation, you then return to step one. You sample a new outer loop value. And you repeat this until all the values of interest have been evaluated. And you've recorded the conditional expected costs and outcomes for each strategy under each value that you're interested in. Okay. So the range of values sampled should cover the range of the probability density function of the parameter. So these may be centiles or deciles. We always kind of do the first centile, the 99th centile, and then the 10th, 20th, 30th, 40th, 50th, 60th, 70th, 80th, and 90th. So that gives us the range, but it means that we've covered the range with only 11 outer loop values. We don't have to do the thousands of outer loop values that the conventional expected value of perfect parameter information requires. So Benham Sharif, I apologize if I've pronounced your name incorrectly there, Benham, has asked, by POSA, do you mean the same approach as EVPPI? It's analytically the same approach, except that we're not doing it. We're not, as I say on this side, we're not constructing the probability of the value being selected by running thousands of simulations. We are selecting the values that cover the range described by the probability density function, and then we read off the probability of that value of being observed from the probability density function. So we've already got that information in the PDF. And the other difference between POSA and EVPPI is, as I said earlier, we're using that data to address a different question. Not what is the change in the probability of making the wrong decision by doing this piece of research, by knowing this parameter with certainty, and therefore the change in the reduction in the value or the cost of making the wrong decision, which is what EVPPI tells us. We're saying, what is the probability that we observe a value in this parameter that would change the decision from, or the indicated decision, from a positive to a negative or a negative to a positive. But it's the same structure of the analysis, but it's a much simpler one because, or less computationally intensive, because we don't need to do it with thousands of outer loops and thousands of inner loops, because we read the probability off the PDF. So you can do, the smoother you want, or the more nuanced and precise you want to describe the sensitivity of the decision or the indicated decision to the value that's taken, then the more precise or detailed the level at which you select values from the PDF. So you know, if you're doing centiles, you probably, you know, that's 100. That's 100 outer loops. And if you think your decision maker wants to know the threshold at which it flips, you probably want to do that sort of level of precision and that number of outer loops. But if you're at the first space of showing the sensitivity of the result and the broad, you know, probability that a value is observed that changes the indicated decision, then I think the first and 99th and then the deciles in between is adequate. Okay. So just a note here, we could calculate a conditional incremental cost effectiveness ratio. But the problem with ISAs is as the incremental effect approaches 0, the ISA approaches infinity, and we can't plot that. So David Ben and Israel has said, if you can read the probability of the density function, why do you need to randomly sample the value of the parameter? What would you change if you intentionally selected these values? We don't randomly sample, we select them. So I use the word sample, but it's not random. I could equally and probably, with hindsight, should have said select. But you select the value. I think that's probably a better word. So thank you, David, for helping me to clarify that, because you're right. We don't need to randomly sample. We are selecting them, these usually sort of 11 values for the outer loops that cover the range. It's really important that they cover the range, so it's not arbitrary. It has to cover the range described by the PDF. And then we read off the probability of observing those values from the PDF. So thanks for that, David. Good point, and I think helped me clarify. And even thank you, David. It's good that to hear that I make sense, because I'm not always sure I do. So that's great. Thank you. So then we simply rank the costs and outcomes of each strategy sampled by the sampled value of the parameter, by the probability, sorry, of the sampled value of the parameter. And we use the reference case value of lambda, so the cost effectiveness threshold, to calculate the, when you've got two strategies being compared, to calculate the incremental net monetary benefit for each selected value with that well-known formula. So we're putting it in the net monetary benefit space. You could put it in the net health benefit space. What we don't want to do is to try and do it in the ISA space, because that's not easily plotted, as because it approaches infinity as the effectiveness value approaches 0. So it's got a discontinuity there. So then we add in the probability data from the PDF, and at that point we have the data that will allow us to describe the probability that a net benefit that would change the decision could be observed, and the probability that it will be observed, and what that value is, and we can plot that in a really accessible way. So we call these conditional incremental net monetary benefit curves, or net benefit curves, and these are from a model of that was comparing chemo-sparing tests in breast cancer. And so we've got 3 parameters we've looked at. The first one is the probability of chemo, the hazard ratio of the probability of requiring chemo according to the Prosigna test. Okay. And what we can see is there's really a very low probability that takes a value. So it's probably about 5 or 6% that takes a value that would lead to a negative net benefit. Almost the whole range is above, in the positive net benefit space. And because all of those values have been generated through the PSA, the correlations and the non-linearity in the model have been respected and reflected in these results. we've got the next one is the relative risk reduction for reduction in risk of distance recurrence between the tests Prosigna versus Oncotype, if I remember rightly. So it's so close. It has almost no impact. You know, the sensitivity of the net benefit to this is close to zero. You could imagine if you put it as a scatter plot on the cost effectiveness plane, it would be clustered around the origin. And then the third line is the probability of, for those patients who get chemo, local recurrence, given that they've got chemo after having an Oncotype test. And this one's, whilst the net benefit, both positive and negative, doesn't actually go very high, above or below, there is actually a reasonable probability that you could go from the reference case is a just cost effective to change to say actually this is not cost effective. So the probability of local recurrence in those patients who have chemotherapy as a result of their Oncotype DX test is a parameter that actually could change the reference case decision to a negative to don't. So really easy to read off and interpret, I think. So all of this is in this paper published in Pharmacoeconomics at the very end of last year. So you can go away and read it and come back. You want to send us any questions, that would be great. Very happy to try and answer questions. But of course, the limitation at this point is we have only talked about an evaluation with two comparators. And often we have many more than two comparators. So we have a manuscript that we're just about to submit on the extension of this to evaluations with three or more comparators strategies. So I'll just talk through that briefly and then hopefully be open to questions. Okay. The process for generating the data is identical. Select a parameter, sample or select the outer loop value for the parameter, run the inner loop, record the conditional expected costs and outcomes for all strategies, and then do it again until you have your inner loop values recorded for all of the values of interest for this parameter. So that's identical, but you're just doing it for more than two strategies. These are the incremental net benefit monetary net benefit curves, looking at varying the cost of chemotherapy and the reference strategy is chemotherapy for all. So we've got 5 tests, 5 strategies, 4 tests being compared to chemotherapy for all. But if we change our comparator from chemotherapy to all to being the test Prosigna, if we say that's the reference case, that's what we're doing now, and everything else is compared about it, well, which is the best value strategy changes just because of what we choose to use as the as essentially the comparator, the standard care comparator. So that's not particularly helpful to get results that are so unstable. Decision makers are not going to be sure what to do with that. So that's a limitation. We don't want to be in the incremental space when we have more than one strategy, because we then don't get a definitive set of results that we can present to the decision maker. The solution is really easy. The solution is to move out of the incremental net monetary benefit space and into the absolute net monetary benefit space, because always the technology with the highest net monetary or net health benefit is the best value strategy. That's that will always be the case. So actually, we don't need to worry about increments, whether we've got 2 or 3 or 4 or 10. The technology with the highest expected net monetary benefit is the best value technology. So we change what we do with the data from the simulation. We don't, in terms of getting the output, but the simulation process to generate the data is identical. And what we do with the data is, so here we've done run the simulation, and we're looking at the parameter we're looking at is the cost of one of the tests, which is called Oncotype DX. And this isn't the price of the test, this is the total cost of the test. So all the stuff to do with capturing the tissue sample, transporting it, processing it before it then gets sent off to the lab, and then getting the lab result back. So all of those, so it's not a price, it's the whole cost to the health system of using the Oncotype DX test. And we've looked at the sensitivity of the results to that to that parameter. And if you look, you'll see that, unsurprisingly, none of the other parameters are affected by this. The only set of net benefit that changes is the Oncotype the conditional net monetary benefit for Oncotype DX. Here we've plotted those absolute net monetary benefit curves for each of them, and you can see the others are unaffected, so they predictably, they're just horizontal lines, and that's as they should be. And what's useful here is we can see that actually only 2 of the technologies are ever the best value. And so we can remove the other technologies. So Oncotype DX is the best value for the majority, just about the majority of the range of possible values. But after that, it's Prosigna risk of recurrence that's the best value. So we can drop the other curves because they are not relevant to the decision, okay? Because they're never the best value strategy. We just have to look at Oncotype DX and Prosigna ROR, so risk of recurrence score for Prosigna. Where's our... I seem to have lost a slide here. It's a bit of concern. Oops, I've lost a slide. It's not good. So what I'm going to, I'll just use this slide to talk to and see, right. I'm going to use my pointer. So the idea is that the frontier, much like the cost effectiveness acceptability frontier, plots the range of the best value strategy for all values, but instead of it being the willingness to pay that the cost effectiveness acceptability frontier uses, it's the decile of the parameter that we're doing the one-way sensitivity analysis on. So you can see all the way out to here, the frontier covers this, the Oncotype DX line up to here, and then at this point the frontier would then map onto the Prosigna ROR and follow that path there. And what we do, and what you would see if I had sent the right slide deck in, is that we overlay that with I use a red dashed line to show the frontier. And for a decision maker, they can see that there is approximately a 40% chance that the cost of Oncotype DX could take a value that would make Prosigna risk of recurrence score more cost effective, the better value test. And so we drop the other tests off because they just distract the decision maker and they're not actually part of the question. So that's that. And so here's the summary slide. Conventional deterministic one-way sensitive analysis is inadequate because it doesn't give the decision maker all the information they need to understand the decision uncertainty and how it's affected by the value a parameter takes. It's at risk of bias because it doesn't take account of correlations and nonlinearity. And through tornado diagrams, it's prone to misinterpretation by decision makers. In contrast, probabilistic one-way sensitivity analysis is now highly computationally feasible. It doesn't produce biased outputs. It does provide decision makers with the information on the probability that a parameter will take a value that would change the decision. And it can be communicated effectively using conditional net monetary benefit, line graphs, and frontiers. So we would argue, as a set of authors, that there really is no valid reason for undertaking nor reporting deterministic one-way sensitivity analyses in cost-effectiveness analysis anymore. It's time that we put deterministic one-way sensitivity analyses to bed as an output from economic evaluation. I just note lots of people when they hear me say this say, but we use this to bug check, to check whether the model's working right. And that's fine. That is a technical part of model development. We're talking about what you report or what we report to decision makers as an output from a completed, validated analysis. And deterministic one-way sensitivity analyses have no place in those reports. Okay, so that's me finished. Happy to answer any questions people may have at this point. So Eldon says, do we have a publication? So the Pharmacoeconomics December 2019 is the incremental net benefit, conditional incremental net benefit curves, and we're literally just about to send the manuscript off this week for the net monetary benefit frontier. Okay, thanks, Eldon. Why do we need PSA if we've already done POSA? Well, PSA is necessary to get the unbiased estimate of the expected costs and outcomes. POSA is used to tell decision makers the sensitivity of the expectation to one specific parameter. Okay, so our reference case expected net benefit is still read off the POSA, off the PSA. Okay, and then the POSA is a second set of analyses that address how sensitive is the result to one to this specific parameter. So we do need both. So Kai says, I have a question about uncertainty not necessarily related to POSA. Sometimes we can only find point estimates for model parameters. What would you recommend, using point estimates or estimate the uncertainty in an arbitrary way? Okay, so actually what I've seen a very good answer to this question in some work that Erin Kerwin did in giving some advice actually to Mike Paulden. So what I'm going to say is that I will ask Erin when she's got time, to write up a little note about her approach to doing this, and then and post it post it out to the people who are logged onto this onto this talk, because it's a better answer than mine was. Any more questions? Kyle said, I'm finding that one-way sensitive analysis is useful for companies that have a product in development. It is a fast way to show how changes in a variable affect the overall benefit of their product. For example, should a company focus on increasing sensitivity or reducing complications? Do you see any issues in this? I think early in a product's development, it's it's okay for exploratory things, but the moment you're dealing with a decision that has substantial resource effects, so an investment either by the developers or the public, then actually it's worth doing the more detailed analysis, the probabilistic analysis, because the cost of making a wrong decision because of the inaccuracy or bias of deterministic approaches can be really substantial. So to help people in that early stage, then okay. But once you're actually putting together a comprehensive model, I would say you need to do POSA, because they're going to make important decisions on the basis of the analyses that have significant resource implications, and therefore the problems with deterministic approaches make that difficult to defend. If it goes wrong and they come back and criticize you and you haven't done the probabilistic analysis, then you're going to open yourself up to legitimate criticism. So when we're reading off, remember those we've done the whole range, and it's those deciles or centiles are the proportions of the total distribution. So essentially we've got between 0 probability and a probability of 1. So it's a cumulative probability, so that we rank, and so that way we actually, by plotting it on that cumulative space, we that's how we read off that there's 20% or 40% chance that it takes a value that changes the decision. Okay. So when I said you read off the probabilities and then you rank them by the probabilities, the results by the probabilities, so from 0 through to 1, then that gets you the ability to read off that way. Okay. Oh, says, any other questions? So Mark says, in your previous uses of POSA, what data informs the probability density function for the parameter of interest? Well, it's the same data that you use to specify your probability density function for the parameter for the probabilistic, the complete probabilistic sensitivity analysis. So that might be from the trial report, where you might have mean effects and standard errors. You might have event rates from which you can characterize beta distributions. It might be from private data on resource utilization. So it might be data collected alongside trials, where you can again model out the expected costs and standard errors on them. Again, you then use to characterize the probability density function. And so there's NOAA runs a course, I think a couple of times a year, maybe 3 times a year, on how to build models for probabilistic sensitivity analysis that includes the coverage, how do you define the PDF from the available evidence. So, okay. I think that might be it. So my pleasure, Mark. We're coming to the end of the hour. Thanks for joining us. I hope you found it interesting. As I say, if you have specific questions, then get in touch, and we'll do our best to get back to you. Hope this has been helpful. Bye-bye.